did the same thing on the east side of the mountain that they had done on the west side of the mountain. They installed the so-called South Canaan Loop, which then took these steam locomotives, conventional steam locomotives with, 20, 30 conventional rail cars filled with coal down the ridge lines going towards South Canaan, swinging around, coming back into the Lake Lodore amusement park, which is another big attraction on the line, into Waymart, and then these coal cars went right into Honesdale. And by that point, the Erie Railroad and others were taking coal shipments out of Honesdale. So they did, and the canal was closed in 99, so they didn't have to reload the coal. But they were then taking these coal cars by means of the Erie Railroad and also the D&H from there to everywhere in America. So they had both of these, on both sides of the mountain. They had this, astonishing rail lines. If you go up there today, to try and sort out the rail lines, the remains of rail lines that you see on top of that mountain, is not an easy thing, because there was the 1829 configuration. It was revised in 1841-43. It was revised in 1858. There were revisions in 1868, and all the rail beds are there. And if you know about rail lines and stuff, railroad beds have a way of not going away. They're just sort of there. You can sort of see that a rail line went through that up there, but what exactly am I looking at? And then but the new rail line may go this way. So that mountain is covered with rail line, vestiges of earlier rail lines. So it makes it a little bit difficult to do engineering research on that mountain because of the great number of rail lines. You can go up there today and find pretty much the sites of many of the stationary steam engines. As I say, they were stationary engines at the top of the plains, and there was cables came from the engine houses, which pulled these cars up the inclined planes. One of the astonishing people that they had involved in the operation of this line very early was John Roebling, who invented the wire cable, the wire rope, which was used in the aqueducts constructed by the D&H over various rivers between here and the Hudson River. And using this same wire rope, the Brooklyn Bridge was built. Brooklyn Bridge, which was also built by Roebling, would not have been possible without the innovative work done on the D&H Railroad here. But this wire rope is essentially like a conventional hemp rope that one might find in an average sort of 19th century barn to sort of move hay around or something. A very thick hemp rope, except it's strands of metal wire, and then the wire enclosed in various casings and so on to strengthen it. But that was used by the D&H folks to make these aqueducts. The one of which is still standing and in beautiful condition, the Lackawanna Aqueduct over at across the Delaware in Lackawanna. And you can walk over that these days, and there it is, this monument to John Roebling. You go over there and look at that bridge, it just blow you away to think this was done in the middle of the 19th century, and there it is now, just as strong as it was when completed.
That's the one that's called the Roebling Bridge.
The Roebling Bridge, yes.
Yeah.
And what they had, why they built that aqueduct, essentially, then what the canal did is the canal went over this bridge. I mean, it was not a rail bridge. It was the canal itself went across this bridge, and they did that for at least two reasons. One was with all the logging operations in the Delaware River, there were a lot of problems caused by conflicts between loggers and canal people. The loggers were just sending these great huge log rafts down the Delaware River, and the canal boats had to cross the river at that point. because initially, when the canal first opened, the canal there at Lackawanna, leaving Honesdale, got to Lackawanna, came out to the edge of the Delaware River. And what they did is, at that point, was essentially, with these loaded canal boats, sort of shoot across the river and then pick up the canal on the other side. So they took the mules and things across on rope ferries and stuff. But the canal boats, they got to the edge of the Hudson River and sort of out into the river, and then down the river a little bit. They then got the boat back into another basin and got it back into the canal system on the other side of the river. Well, that, as you can imagine, was a source of endless headaches because of high water and low water and these logging problems and so on. So they had huge problems associated with getting across the Delaware River. So at that point, they decided to put the canal above the river. And so you have this magnificent rolling aqueduct over there, which is still there today. And so the canal itself got to the edge of the Delaware River and continued right across the top of the Delaware River. And this happened in the middle of the 19th century and operated with great success until the canal closed in 1899. And that too was revised several times in the course of the 19th century. The numbers don't come to mind immediately, but when it first opened, it was 4 feet deep, and then it was 5 feet deep and 20 feet wide, and they kept making it bigger so they could get bigger boats with greater tonnage and get more coal to market. Those numbers are all very available on how deep it was and how wide it was. Yes, sir?
Well, they use it now, right, for single one-lane to drive your car over now.
Yes, do they still allow vehicular
I was just
traffic
up there
over?
last year.
But there were a lot of problems with it. The Park Service now has it, and they've restructured and strengthened and so on. But you can drive across it, or you can walk across, essentially through where the mules walked these days. You can walk across the top of this astonishing rolling aqueduct. There's so much to be said on that canal. The canal cost $6 million to build in 1828. Now Dale must have the answer to this. How much $6 million in 1828 would be today? I mean, I'm sure there are charts somewhere that convert this for you, and Dale will be the person to find that chart. But the canal cost $6 million to build. That's a lot of bananas. And the railroad cost $3 million to build. So there's $9 million expenditure on the part of the D&H in the 1820s. The generation of my grandparents in the 1880s, to get a sense of money, my grandparents decided to get married when my grandfather was making $1 a day. He's making $1 a day. We can make this work. So in the 1880s, when he was making $1 a day, they got married. So this was, 1880s. So my great-grandparents. So think about what $9 million must have been like in 1828. if $1 a day was a very respectable wage.
9 billion of
Oh, I bet. In the 1880s, I mean, it was just unbelievable investment in this engineering feat. The railroad and the canal, there's so many aspects of it that are interesting and that have not really been explored in great detail. In one of these monthly talks that go on in Carbondale on this railroad, focused only on horses and mules, and the canal and the railroad. And there's so much to be said and so much to be reported on the role of horses and mules in this system. Not only the mules pulling the canal boats, but the horses and the mules in the mines, and the horses and the mules in the operation of the rail lines in the Lackawanna Valley. And that's a very interesting topic to explore in great detail. Another very interesting topic is the, as I said earlier, the extension of the line, the gravity line down the valley, as we say, to Archbold in 1841, 43, and then to Oliphant in the 50s. But and then to Providence by 1860. In 1858, you get as far as Oliphant by the gravity. The end of the gravity system was in Oliphant, and then from Oliphant to Providence, there was a level steam line with this very rudimentary steam locomotives, which you then got off the gravity car and went on with a steam locomotive from Oliphant to Providence. At which point, if you're going into Scranton further, you then got on a street railway pulled by a horse as well, so that the extension of the line down the valley is a very interesting and complicated topic too. I recently was on foot trying to sort some of this stuff out in Providence, and there are lots of D&H buildings still in Providence that it's amazing they're still there. And one is on Depot Street in Providence is that beautiful D&H office building, which these guys know about because they're shaking their heads in the right way. But I looked and looked and looked to find out exactly what that beautiful building was. I knew it was a fancy building right there by the railroad tracks. It had to be somehow connected with the D&H. Finally, in a deed book for we bought a couple of 19th century D&H deed books, and they were doing some kind of repair, and there was a sketch of that Depot Street area where the buildings were all identified, and there it was in that plot, just on the northwest corner of Depot Street and the railroad tracks, D&H office, it says on it. I mean, I wanted to see that in print, and there it was in one of those mid-century deed books. Across the street from that was where the depot was, and the freight stations in Providence are still there. But the D&H and the DL&W, of course, were at each other's throats vehemently at the time, because the DL&W said, no, you are not coming into Scranton. And they stopped them dead at the Providence line, and the D&H finally finagled their way around it, primarily through the astonishingly creative and innovative footwork of Thomas Dixon City man, Thomas Dixon, to get into Scranton, and then by these unbelievable rail negotiations and boardroom mergers and deals and so on, the D&H got itself into Scranton, and then to Wilkes-Barre, and farther south. But that has never really been investigated in great detail, and I think I had another one of these monthly talks only on this valley road down to Providence, and in the course of doing the research for that, learned a lot about what happened down here, which nobody's ever written about that. They just said, oh yes, to Providence by 1860, and then, the world by 1880. But nobody ever really sort of goes into detail. And it's a very interesting tale to tell what happened in down here. The Van Storch breaker, which is, if you're in the Green Ridge Shopping Center and you look west, you see the remains of a breaker, at the top of which now it says Dreeder Coal Company, but also that was the Von Storch breaker. And the finagling they went through to get a toehold in Providence, and then they got the rights to ship their coal through Providence, and then they kept sort of inching their way forward until finally they had a connection into Scranton with all these railroad deals that were just, they're enough to sort of curl your hair, some of the things they did, but they managed to get themselves to Wilkes-Barre and the immense coal reserves in the Wilkes-Barre area, all of which were brought up through this system up through the Lackawanna Valley and then into Carbondale over the mountain. It's quite an experience to go, like, 100 miles from here way over in the remote regions, High Falls, New York, and over in that way towards the Hudson River, and to come across this ditch through the woods that's no wider than from here to that wall, not even that wide, and to realize that the hundreds of millions of tons of coal out of this valley all passed right there in front of you through this complicated rail system that went out of the Lackawanna Valley. One of the very interesting things about this anthracite coal and these rail lines and the canal lines out of the Lackawanna Valley is in this Lackawanna Valley, it was the first sort of industrial valley in America. Nobody preceded it. This is in the 1820s. What was going on here in the Lackawanna Valley was seminal to what was going to happen in America in the next couple hundred years. Because the whole economy, before that, everybody lived on a farm, everybody lived in these sort of rural situations and so on. There was not really a sort of industrial thing going on in America. Philadelphia to a certain extent, New York to a certain extent, but nothing quite as unified as what went on in this Lackawanna Valley from Simpson to Nanticoke. And what happened in this valley is unbelievable. Not only technologically, but also sociologically, and also, well, you're all interested in genealogy, and we all worship at the Joe Breyer altar, with his genealogical research. But people from all over the world came to this Lackawanna Valley, and that's one of the things which makes it so interesting. And there's so many misconceptions out there about life in the Lackawanna Valley in the 19th century. Granted, life was tough, life was hard. But the people who came here, from everywhere they came, life was good. They were successes. They saw themselves as leading successful lives. They saw themselves on an upward path. They didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, but their children had 4, and their children had 8. They were on an upward ascent. And one of the things which is galling is the fact that most of the 19th century writing on the valley, people seem to assume that, oh yes, everyone lived in a tar paper shack by the side of the road and blah blah. Life was tough. A lot of the so-called modern conveniences that we all seem to think are necessary these days didn't exist. But life was in an upward path. They were successes. They built communities. They built all these wonderful churches and all these civic and fraternal organizations. They all learned English. They all knew what a bar of soap was and how to use it. They all built communities. They all life was good. Life was better here than wherever they were coming from with no work at all. And I'm not sticking my head in the sand and saying there were not lots of difficulties and a lot of rough times and lots of things to be overcome, but their lives were successful. They saw themselves as successful, and life was good. But we tend to have it stuffed on our throats by the standard histories that the poor folks, and they shivered from November till March and had 2 chicken legs to eat all winter. Granted, there were good years and bad, but for the most part, life was on an upward path, and life was good. And the vestiges of all that are everywhere. All these family values and community values and things that most of us grew up with, most of which are going or virtually gone from community lives, were very much a part of daily life for most of these people who led very enriched, full, gratifying lives. And that's been sort of swept under the carpet by most sort of approaches to 19th century history. And that's not the case. You just have to look at some of these 19th century newspapers, which are filled with articles about church, community, civic, family things that are very positive and lots of very successful stuff going on. It's amazing how matter of fact they were about mine accidents and rail accidents and life and death. You know, it was just, one went to work thinking, well, maybe I'm not going to come back alive, but life goes on. And that happened too many tens of thousands of times, probably. Lots of people were killed. But, you know, life goes on, life is good, here we are. And it's great to be in America where these things are possible. That is very much a part of the social history associated with these rail lines and with these coal mines. Disaster after disaster after disaster, but, you know, pick up the pieces and keep going. And they did that. And it's interesting that we have in Carbondale a sign about this big, a metal sign, which says, in I think it's 5 or 6 languages, I know of 5 or 6 languages, if you're involved in an accident, please report to your supervisor at once, or something like that. But it's in English, Welsh, Slovenian, Czechoslovakian, Hungarian. I don't know what the 5 or 6 languages off the top of my head are, but there they all are. This was a sign that was posted in this you know, there were these signs like this were everywhere for this astonishing community from all over the world. You look at and it's interesting to look at it from that sociological perspective. Now, Dale, with all his cemetery work, you sort of see these things where, you know, suddenly there are all kinds of, lots of deaths from, you know, from like the epidemics and the spotted fever and the black fever from the 1850s and 60s and all these sorts of things. And you can follow patterns of disease and age of death, but you also follow patterns of immigration, where suddenly you're seeing all these German names, and then you're seeing lots of English names, people identifying themselves as being English or Cornish, or being you know, then the mid-century Irish immigrations, and then lots of Northern Europeans, and then Central Europeans, and huge immigrations of people from Hungarians coming in the 70s and the 80s. So to see these patterns of immigration and patterns of names, and I think you see this, I'm sure Joe sees this and the rest of the group in genealogical research, where you can judge who was arriving when and who was dying when by the ethnicity of the names. In the 1870s, there were huge labor problems in the Lackawanna Valley, and 1873, 77 was the strike, but in the early 1870s, lots of labor problems began, and the mines were closed for 3 months at a time, 2 months at a time here. The railroads were closed. Nobody, you know, there was lots of sort of negotiations back and forth, lots of sensitive feelings right there on the surface. And in reading the newspapers from the 1870s, I try to sort of keep as many ears open as possible and eyes open as I read. I suddenly was aware of all the references I kept coming across to huckleberries. And I thought, all this huckleberry business, what is all this huckleberry stuff about? Now, I think many of you know, or most of you know, huckleberries are delicious. I mean, they make the so-called current blueberries look ridiculous when you talk about huckleberries. I mean, they're smaller and more flavorful. Now you buy huckleberries or blueberries, whatever they might call them in the store. They're the size of large marbles, and they're pretty, but they're sort of largely tasteless. The big and puffy and not much flavor. Like strawberries. Strawberries don't taste like, they're pretty and red, but that's about it, you know. But the huckleberries are smaller and much more flavorful. And one of the sort of, not silly, but it started out in my mind thinking it was sort of silly, sort of sidebar thing, was I announced I was going to talk about huckleberries in Carbondale, one of these Thursday night things. And believe it or not, there were a couple of fruit merchants in Carbondale who would, the statistics shipped over the D&H. They would, like, on Tuesday, so-and-so sent 55 bushels of huckleberries to Binghamton on the morning train, this kind of stuff. So-and-so sent 150 bushels on Thursday. You can't imagine the number of huckleberries that went out of the Lackawanna Valley in the 1870s. And the interesting point was, the whole family went huckleberry. The mines were closed, the railroads were not operating, everybody went huckleberry. And huckleberries essentially filled the bill. I mean, you could make a decent daily wage by picking huckleberries from the middle of, end of June till the early August or whatever it was. And the statistics on the amount of shipping of huckleberries over the local railroads is very amusing and interesting. And when you put them all together, I bet I have 50 articles from newspapers giving statistics on the amount of huckleberries sent out of Carbondale, Mayfield, Carbondale, Blakely. That was the primary reference for those Carbondale papers, but hundreds and hundreds of bushels of huckleberries being sent out per day, by means of which one could make a few dollars. They were selling it for 10 cents a quart, but might could make a few dollars to sort of keep body and soul together. And one of the very wonderful kinds of articles I come across that I find very interesting are when someone, they're talking about, I don't know, labor problems and strikes, and then people say, well, as long as we have a cow and a place to grow vegetables, we're okay. And that's really that's the way I was raised in that world, and that means a lot. I relate immediately to that sort of, those kinds of, that kind of approach to the world. I mean, if you have a cow in the garden, what else do you need? I mean, you could make it. But that's just one of dozens and dozens of sort of side things which make this history of this D&H rail line so interesting, because it's all part of this same Lackawanna Valley thing, and that's why it's a lot of it has never been really reported. A lot of it is there to be discovered, but a lot of it has not been reported. And that's what I'm trying to gather tons of this stuff in this book I'm working on. In addition to the basic technological things about the functioning of the railroad, which is just unbelievable. The breakers and there was one breaker in the Carbondale yard, the Lackawanna breaker, where 800 people worked in one breaker. Can you imagine that? I just can't even imagine that. 500 people in Carbondale worked at Farview and on Shepherd's Crook. The 6 o'clock train bearing the 500 workers from Farview and Shepherd's Crook arrived at the Lincoln Avenue station an hour later. Those kinds of numbers they're hard to put together in our current perspective on the world. But tens of thousands, yes sir.
Can you touch a little bit on the Underwood?
On the Underwood, yes. The Underwood was established in 1912 by F.D. Underwood, who was an official of the Erie Railroad, and he came and visited this model town called Underwood, which was located just up here up behind, what's the name of the school, Mid Valley, or up on what's the name? Mid Valley, yeah. Up beyond Mid Valley School, and his name was F.D. Underwood, and the town was established in 1912. It closed in 1936. It closed for 3 reasons. The first reason, by 1930, the companies realized it was no longer necessary to have key personnel living right at your mine operation, because the automobile made it possible to live farther away. So there was no need to have these people living right there at the colliery. And so that caused people to move away from collieries, and therefore that was no longer necessary to maintain the town. That was the one reason. The second reason was they had a growing need for a refuse dump and a silt bank, which was they needed the space to do it, the space for it for those mines. And the third reason was they wanted to undermine the village because there was a huge quantity of coal under Underwood, which they didn't want to access without moving the people out of there. And so the Pittston Coal Company announced in 1936 that they were going to close the community. The community was located both in the boroughs of Troop and Oliphant. Are they both boroughs? Are they in Oliphant and Troop? And this model community, there were the number off the top of my head, I think 48 houses, and because I have a map here. There were 8 houses which belonged to the mining officials, and there were 28 houses, the officials' houses were these 8 houses on the bottom here that were located in the borough of Troop. And then there was a main street up through the other section of town where there were 28 houses which were located in the borough of Oliphant. And in 1981, I spoke to my father specifically on this question, and he identified the occupants of houses 1 through 8. I'm astonished by my father's memory of doing this as an older man. Houses number 1, the family's names were Leitner, he was the mine foreman, Beecham, colliery superintendent, Elvidge, mine foreman, Cordy, mine foreman, Wrightson, mine foreman, Dick, William Dick, plumbing engineer, Silas Powell, my grandfather, electrical engineer, and Hugh Walker was the outside foreman, living in those 8 houses, those 8 official houses, which were steam heated by the power plant at the colliery. And the houses those were single family houses, and then there were the houses where the miners lived, and off the top of his head, my father went through the names: Shotton, Newman, Burns, Fitzsimmons, Bowden, Travis, Sheridan, McCone, Browning, Balderson, May, Bowden, Lake, Washeen, Judd, Shoemaker, Walker, Bowden, Atkinson, Harris, Hulse, H-U-L-S-E, Webb, Logan, Elvidge, Burns, Coates, Sharples, Moretti, Coates, Basiliga, Balderson, Sherrick, Christa, Mason, and Wagner. He couldn't remember 2 or 3 of the other occupants of these houses, but he went up one side of the street and down the other in his mind. I thought, go, Dad, go. It was really, I mean, that was, and then in the Scranton Republican in 1936, when they closed the village, there was an article titled, "Sadness hangs over Underwood as death knell rings for last company village." And here we have the pictures of the houses, the houses of the so-called officials. And my father said that the breaker was to the right, over beyond in that direction, he recalled at that time. Pictures of the community house. And then I found another article in the Scranton Republican, also in July of 1936, about Underwood, where there's lots of very interesting stuff, recollections by various people. A woman by the name of Barbara Robleski, who used to write for the Mid-Valley News, told me that she told me in 1985 that George Hyduck, H-Y-D-U-K, who lived on East Spruce Street in Oliphant, has done many oil paintings of Underwood. Life in this wooded section began in 1912 when the Pennsylvania Coal Company built the first model coal collar around the clearing in the valley at the foot of the Music Mountain. Part of the village was in Oliphant, part in Troop. The dividing line ran right down the center of the main street, and the miners and their families resided in Oliphant while the officials lived in Troop. On Sundays, the schoolhouse became a church, and visiting preachers would deliver the sermon to the older people while a few townsfolk taught Sunday school for the children. There were no stores in the village. You had to come into Oliphant or into Troop. F.D. Underwood, then president of the Erie Railroad, visited there shortly after its completion. They then renamed the village after him. There were 250 hand-picked residents who lived in the village. There were no merchants, bakers, butchers, or candlestick makers. Supplies had to be purchased in either Troop or Oliphant for the convenience of the female portion of the community. A bus ran between Underwood and Troop, meeting the car line in Troop and proceeding into Scranton. No doctor, no nurses. In the center of the town, 2 bathhouses were built for the miners and their families. The first up-to-date wash house ever built for a mining town. All houses were electrically lighted from the electric plant from the colliery. Houses heated by the company's steam plant. There were 6 houses with steam heat from the mines, water, toilets, and electricity. The rent was $15 a month. Later it was raised to $25. 2 rows of houses, this is my father speaking, 2 rows of 10 houses that had no toilets, just hot and cold water, no heat. There was a bathhouse for the people who lived in the 2 rows of 10 houses. Those people didn't take care of the bathhouse, and the bathhouse was closed, and they had to take baths in the kitchen, said he. They never had any labor problems there because there was such a close relationship between the officials and the miners. The 5 superintendents of the colliery in its entire history were E.C. Weichel, W-E-I-C-H-E-L, William Jeffrey, Fred Beecham, Court Snyder, Arthur